June 19, 1944. 2:47 p.m. 180 miles west of the Mariana Islands, Lieutenant Alex Vraciu pushed his F-6F Hellcat into a steep dive at 24,000 feet. Below him, 50 Japanese carrier planes formed up for an attack that would never reach its target. In the next 8 minutes, Vraciu would shoot down 6 enemy aircraft, but that wasn't what changed everything. What changed everything was happening 200 miles behind him, where American radar operators were watching the entire Japanese fleet on screens the enemy didn't even know existed. The Imperial Japanese Navy was about to discover that while they'd been perfecting the art of war, America had been reinventing it entirely. Before we continue with what happened in those waters, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to June 19, 1944, where the largest carrier battle in history was about to reveal a technological gap so wide it would end Japan's naval aviation in a single afternoon. 23 months earlier, Alex Vraciu had been a 23-year-old kid from East Chicago, Indiana, working at his father's restaurant on Indianapolis Boulevard. He was 5'8", barely met the height requirement for naval aviation, and had to argue with 3 different recruitment officers before they'd let him take the pilot exam. His hands smelled like fryer grease when he filled out the application. His father, a Romanian immigrant who'd opened Vraciu's Cafe in 1928, told him he was crazy. "You're going to get yourself killed for what? So you can say you flew a plane?" Alex didn't have a good answer then, but he had one now. Between December 1943 and May 1944, the U.S. Navy lost 287 carrier aircraft in the Central Pacific, not to enemy fighters, to ambush. Japanese planes would appear from nowhere, invisible until they were already firing. Radar systems existed, sure, on some ships, primitive sets that could barely distinguish a cloud from an aircraft at 40 miles. Most of the time, American carriers relied on visual spotters with binoculars, men scanning empty sky until tracers started ripping through the flight deck. Tom Chen was one of those spotters. Full name, Thomas Michael Chen, born in San Francisco's Chinatown, 1921. He and Vraciu met during flight training in Pensacola. Chen washed out on his final carrier landing, came in too hot, collapsed his landing gear, spent 3 weeks in the hospital with a broken collarbone. The Navy reassigned him to spotter duty on the USS Enterprise. "Still gets me in the fight," he told Vraciu the night before the Enterprise deployed to the Marshall Islands. "Besides, somebody's got to watch your back up there." They shook hands, made plans. After the war, they'd open a flight school in California. Vraciu and Chen's Aviation Academy, 50-50 split. They'd teach kids from neighborhoods like theirs, kids who didn't fit the recruitment poster image, that they could fly too. Tom Chen died on February 17, 1944, at 4:23 p.m. A dozen Japanese dive bombers dropped out of a cloud layer at 8,000 feet. Nobody saw them coming. Chen was on the aft spotting platform when the first bomb hit. By the time the alarm sounded, 5 bombs had already struck the Enterprise. Chen and 7 other men died in the first 30 seconds. Vraciu read the casualty report 3 days later. He was in his bunk on the USS Lexington when the mail came through. The letter was from Chen's mother. She'd written to thank Vraciu for being Tom's friend. She mentioned the flight school. Tom had told her about it in his last letter home. Vraciu folded the letter and put it in his footlocker. Then he went up to the flight deck and stared at the horizon until his watch officer ordered him back inside. The problem wasn't Japanese pilots. American pilots were matching them kill for kill by mid-1943. The problem wasn't Japanese planes. The Zero was faster in a climb, sure, but the Hellcat could outdive it and outgun it. The problem was that every engagement started the same way, Japanese planes appearing from nowhere while American planes scrambled to respond. It was like playing poker when your opponent could see your cards, but you couldn't see his. Actually, it was worse than that, because while American carriers relied on visual spotters and primitive radar, the Japanese had refined their approach and strike tactics to perfection. They'd studied cloud formations, sun angles, the precise altitude where engine noise became inaudible from a carrier deck. They knew how to stay invisible. What the Japanese didn't know was that America had stopped trying to spot planes with human eyes. In the 18 months between Pearl Harbor and mid-1943, American scientists and engineers had been working on something that seemed impossible, a radar system that could track individual aircraft at 150 miles, distinguish between friendly and enemy formations, calculate altitude, speed, and heading, and display all of it on a screen clear enough that a 20-year-old sailor with 3 weeks of training could read it in combat. The British had started it with their chain home system. The Americans took it further, much further. By December 1943, a new radar system was being installed on American carriers, the AN/SK-2. It weighed 200 pounds. It required 2 operators and a dedicated power supply. It had a 17-inch cathode ray tube display that showed everything within 200 miles, and it worked. The problem was that nobody trusted it. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, received his first briefing on the AN/SK-2 in January 1944. The demonstration was impressive. Radar operators tracking seagulls at 40 miles, distinguishing between single birds and flocks. But Spruance was 57 years old. He'd spent 35 years learning to fight naval battles with visual sighting, signal flags, and calculated guesswork. Now some physicist from MIT was telling him he could see the enemy before the enemy could see him. "What happens when it breaks?" Spruance asked. "It won't break, sir," the technician said. "Everything breaks in combat," Spruance said. "What happens then?" The technician didn't have a good answer. Spruance authorized installation of the AN/SK-2 on his carriers, but he didn't change his tactical doctrine. Carriers still relied on visual spotters. The radar was supplemental, insurance, not the main event. Then came June 19, 1944. At 10:00 a.m., radar operators on the USS Enterprise detected a large formation 150 miles west, not a cloud, not a malfunction. 73 aircraft heading directly toward the American carrier group. The operators reported it immediately. Spruance made the call every admiral dreams of making and few ever get. Launch all fighters. Vector them to intercept. Do not wait for visual confirmation. 200 F-6F Hellcats launched in 18 minutes. The Japanese formation never got within 60 miles of an American carrier. What should have been a surprise attack, what would have been a surprise attack in every previous battle, turned into a massacre. American fighters, guided by radar operators who could see the entire battlefield, carved through the Japanese formation like they were reading from a script. Alex Vratsiu was in the third wave. He climbed to 24,000 feet and looked down. The sky was full of burning planes. American planes were everywhere. Japanese planes were trying to scatter, trying to get away. But they couldn't, because every time they turned, radar operators on the carriers were already directing fresh fighters to intercept. Vratsiu locked onto a Japanese dive bomber trying to escape through a cloud layer. He fired a 2-second burst. The bomber's engine exploded. Vratsiu pulled up, found another target, fired again. Another hit. He did this 6 times in 8 minutes. 6 confirmed kills. When he landed back on the Lexington, his gun barrels were so hot they'd started to discolor, but Vratsiu wasn't celebrating. He was thinking about Tom Chen, about the spotting platform on the Enterprise, about how Chen had died because nobody could see the enemy coming. And now, 5 months later, American carriers could see everything. The radar operators kept working. For the next 8 hours, they tracked every Japanese aircraft within 200 miles. They vectored fighters to intercept. They warned carriers of incoming attacks with enough advance notice that ships could maneuver into defensive positions. They watched the entire Japanese carrier fleet as it launched strike after strike, and they called out each one before it got within visual range. By 6:00 p.m., the battle was over. The Japanese lost 600 aircraft. The Americans lost 123. In the pilot bars that night, American aviators started calling it the Marianas Turkey Shoot. It was a joke, a way to cope with the scale of what they'd just witnessed. But it wasn't really funny. What they'd witnessed was the end of naval aviation as the Japanese understood it. Japanese commanders knew they'd been devastated. What they didn't understand was how. They'd launched multiple strikes from multiple directions. They'd used cloud cover, sun angles, altitude variation, everything they'd refined over 3 years of combat. And somehow, every time, American fighters had been waiting for them. Exactly where they needed to be. Exactly when they needed to be there. In the after-action reports, Japanese pilots reported that American fighters appeared to know our plans in advance. Some suspected spies. Others thought the Americans had broken their radio codes. A few wondered if the Americans had developed some kind of long-range visual detection system, but none of them guessed radar, because radar technology to the Japanese Naval Command was still theoretical, something that might work someday, not something you'd better carry a battle on. What the Japanese didn't know was that American carriers were now operating with radar systems that could track targets at ranges the Japanese couldn't even conceptualize. The AN-SK-2 had a 200-mile range. Japanese radar systems in June 1944 topped out at 60 miles, and most didn't work reliably beyond 30. The technological gap wasn't just wide, it was generational. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese carrier fleet, realized he'd lost the battle by 4:00 p.m. But he didn't realize he'd lost the war until he read the casualty reports. 600 aircraft lost. More importantly, 400 trained pilots lost. Pilots who'd taken 3 years to train. Pilots who couldn't be replaced. Not in 6 months, not in a year, maybe not ever. Japan had bet everything on a carrier war. They'd built the doctrine, refined the tactics, trained the pilots. They'd assumed that American carriers would fight the same war, just with more resources. What they hadn't anticipated was that America would change the rules entirely. That American carriers wouldn't fight the war Japan had prepared for. They'd fight a completely different war, one where the enemy couldn't hide. After the battle, Admiral Spruance held a briefing for his carrier commanders. He spent 15 minutes thanking the radar operators. Then he spent an hour revising his entire tactical doctrine around radar-guided interception. Everything changed. Carrier positioning, fighter deployment schedules, the role of the combat air patrol. All of it rebuilt around the assumption that American carriers could see the enemy before the enemy could see them. When the briefing ended, Spruance pulled aside Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, the air group commander on the Lexington. "This radar system," Spruance said, "is it really that reliable?" "Sir," Flatley said, "today we intercepted 73 aircraft at 150 miles. Yesterday, we didn't even know they existed until they were in visual range. I'd say it's reliable." Spruance nodded. He didn't smile, but he looked satisfied, like a man who'd just realized he was playing a different game than his opponent, and winning. The story of the AN-SK-2 radar system didn't make headlines. The newspapers talked about American pilots shooting down Japanese planes by the hundreds. They talked about the turkey shoot, They didn't talk about the radar operators sitting in darkened rooms, staring at green screens, calling out intercept coordinates. Nobody took their picture. Nobody interviewed them for the Saturday Evening Post. Alex Vrasiu became an ace that day. He gave interviews, he posed for photos. People asked him how he shot down 6 planes in 8 minutes. He'd smile and say something about training, about staying calm, about trusting your wingman. What he didn't say, what he couldn't say because it was classified until 1947, was that he'd had help. That radar operators had guided him to every single target, that he'd never have found those planes without them. Years later, in 1986, a historian interviewed Vrasiu for a book about carrier aviation in World War II. The historian asked him what moment in the war stood out most. Vrasiu didn't talk about his ace status. He didn't talk about the turkey shoot. He talked about reading the casualty report from the USS Enterprise, about Tom Chen, about how Chen had died trying to spot enemy planes with binoculars, while the technology to save him was already being installed on carriers across the Pacific. "We had the radar," Vrasiu said. "We just didn't believe in it yet. Tom died in February. By June, we'd figured it out. 5 months too late for him." After the war, Vrasiu went back to East Chicago. He didn't open a flight school. He worked as a test pilot for a few years, then took a job with Wells Fargo, then taught high school. He married, had 6 kids, lived in a suburb in California. He didn't talk much about the war. When people asked if he'd fought, he'd say yes and change the subject. The radar operators from June 19, 1944, went back to their regular lives too. Most of them had been college students when they enlisted. Engineers, physicists, math majors. They went back to school, got degrees, took jobs in corporate America. A few ended up working on missile guidance systems during the Cold War. None of them became famous. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Navy held a commemoration ceremony in San Diego. They invited surviving pilots. They screened footage of the battle. They gave speeches about American air power and carrier doctrine. At the end of the ceremony, they showed a brief video about the AN/SK-2 radar system. It lasted 3 minutes. One of the radar operators from the USS Enterprise attended the ceremony. His name was Robert Henley. He'd been 22 years old in 1944, a physics major from Northwestern University. He'd spent 8 hours on June 19th staring at a green screen, calling out coordinates. After the war, he'd gotten his PhD and taught physics at UCLA for 30 years. When the video about the radar system ended, someone in the audience started clapping. Then everyone was clapping. Henley didn't stand up. He didn't want attention. But the guy next to him, another veteran, nudged him. "That's you up there," the guy said. "You should stand." Henley stood for about 10 seconds. Then he sat back down. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, officially ended Japan's carrier aviation. They never recovered. By August 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had 4 carriers left, and almost no trained pilots to fly from them. The war was over. But the technological shift that started with the AN/SK-2 radar system didn't end. After the war, radar systems became standard on every naval vessel, every aircraft carrier, every bomber, every fighter jet. The idea that you could see the enemy before they saw you, that you could track them, predict their movements, intercept them before they knew you existed, became the foundation of modern air combat. When Alex Vrasiu died in 2015 at age 96, his obituary in the Los Angeles Times mentioned that he'd been a flying ace in World War II. It didn't mention Tom Chen. It didn't mention the AN/SK-2 radar system. It said he'd been a test pilot and a teacher, that he'd loved baseball, that he'd been married for 62 years. There's a small museum in East Chicago, Indiana now, the Vrasiu Heritage Museum. It has his flight jacket, some photos, a model of his F-6F Hellcat, There's a plaque on the wall with the names of other veterans from East Chicago who didn't come home. Tom Chen's name is on that plaque. Below his name, in small letters, USS Enterprise, February 17th, 1944. The plaque doesn't mention that Chen died 4 months before the technology that could have saved him became standard issue. It doesn't need to. The dates tell the story. On June 19, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a carrier strike against the U.S. Fifth Fleet and discovered that America wasn't fighting the war they'd trained for. They discovered it the way most people discover they're wrong, slowly, then all at once. First, American fighters appearing where they shouldn't be. Then, more fighters. Then, realizing that every time they adjusted tactics, American fighters adjusted faster. Then, watching their aircraft disappear from the sky in numbers that didn't make tactical sense. Then, finally, sitting in a debriefing room at sunset and trying to explain to an admiral how you lost 600 aircraft in a single afternoon when your intelligence had promised you'd have the element of surprise. The Japanese called it a disaster. The Americans called it a turkey shoot. Neither side called it what it actually was, the moment when technology changed war faster than tactics could keep up. If this story moved you, if you're sitting there thinking about Tom Chen on that spotting platform, or Alex Vrasiu reading that letter, or those radar operators staring at green screens while the future of naval warfare played out on their displays, then do something about it. Hit the like button, subscribe to this channel. These stories don't stay alive by accident. They stay alive because people like you give a damn about history that doesn't fit neatly into textbooks. And drop a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if you served. Tell us if someone in your family served. Tell us if you've ever heard of the ANSK-2 radar system before today, because this channel exists to tell the stories nobody else is telling. And we want to know who's listening. Thanks for keeping these heroes from being forgotten. We'll see you in the next one.